I am Maya, 35 years old, and for 12 years I bled to turn my father's failing local coffee shop into a regional empire. Last Saturday at our 30th anniversary gala, he stood up and handed the entire company to my younger sister's white boyfriend of 8 months, calling me too aggressive and selfish to lead. He told me to be grateful I still had a job. I simply smiled and raised my glass to the happy couple. What my father did not know was that 3 years ago, I secretly bought the commercial warehouse we operate out of to save us from eviction, and I solely hold the patents to our top-selling blends. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through a betrayal while holding the winning hand. Growing up in Atlanta, Crown Roasters was more than just a family business. It was a staple in our community, a place my father Calvin built from the ground up. But by the time I graduated with my business degree 12 years ago, Crown Roasters was drowning in debt. My father was a visionary roaster, but a terrible businessman. I stepped in as chief operations officer and gave up my 20s to save his dream. I worked 80-hour weeks, renegotiated vendor contracts, modernized our distribution, and expanded us from a single struggling shop into a regional powerhouse, supplying boutique cafes and high-end grocery stores across the South. I hired a dedicated team of veteran staff from our neighborhood people who relied on our health benefits and fair wages to feed their families. I treated the business like it was my own child, because my father always promised that one day it would be mine. That promise evaporated on a rainy Saturday evening inside the grand ballroom of the Omni Hotel. We were celebrating the 30th anniversary of Crown Roasters. The room was draped in gold and deep espresso brown. A jazz quartet played softly in the corner, and 50 of our top investors, board members, and extended family members sat at crystal-adorned tables. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, exhaustion sitting heavy in my bones, after spending the entire morning on the roasting floor fixing a supply chain issue. I thought tonight was the night my father would finally announce my transition to chief executive officer. Instead, the nightmare began when my younger sister Chloe made her grand entrance. Chloe is 28, stunning, and has never worked a day in her life. She was the golden child, the one my parents shielded from the harsh realities of the business. Walking beside her was Julian, her boyfriend of exactly 8 months. Julian was a 32-year-old white man whose only claim to fame was a tech startup that filed for bankruptcy 2 years ago. He wore a velvet dinner jacket and carried himself with an unearned arrogance that set my teeth on edge from the day I met him. For the past few months, my father had been enamored with Julian, constantly praising his corporate pedigree and his refined aesthetic, completely ignoring the fact that the man knew absolutely nothing about coffee supply chains or the community that built our brand. My father tapped his spoon against his champagne glass, calling the room to attention. He walked to the microphone, his smile wide, as he looked out over the crowd. He spoke about the early days of Crown Roasters, the struggles and the triumphs. I waited for him to mention the late nights I spent balancing the books, the accounts I secured, the literal sweat equity I poured into his legacy. He did not mention me once. Instead, he signaled for Julian and Chloe to join him on stage. It is time for Crown Roasters to enter a new era. My father announced, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. I am officially stepping down and retiring. But a modern brand requires modern dynamic leadership. It requires a fresh, relatable vision to reach a wider demographic. Therefore, I am proud to announce that I am transferring a 60% majority equity stake to my future son-in-law Julian, who will be taking over immediately as Chief Executive Officer. The room erupted into polite applause, but the sound was completely drowned out by the rushing of blood in my ears. I sat frozen, staring at my father as he shook Julian's hand. He was giving away the company I built to a man who had not earned a single share of it. He was handing over my life's work to a stranger simply because Julian looked the part of a Silicon Valley executive. I pushed my chair back, the harsh scraping sound cutting through the applause. I stood up and walked directly toward the stage, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice low but carrying enough force to make the board members at the front tables turn their heads. "What are you doing?" "We had a succession plan. We have been working toward my transition for 5 years. My father's smile vanished. He stepped off the stage to meet me, his expression hardening into the same authoritarian scowl he used whenever I dared to question him. "This is exactly why you are not ready, Maya," he snapped, not bothering to lower his voice. "Look at you. You are too aggressive. You lack the refined executive presence this company needs to scale nationally. You lead with emotion instead of strategy." I stared at him in utter disbelief. Strategy. I managed the logistics that pulled you out of $4 million of debt. I secured the regional distribution contracts. Julian bankrupted his only venture. He does not even know the difference between a light roast and a dark roast. Julian stepped down from the stage, sliding his hands into his pockets with a condescending smirk. "Now, Maya, there is no need to be hostile," Julian said, his voice dripping with faux professionalism. "Calvin and I have discussed this extensively. The brand is too niche. It is too tied to the local neighborhood. I bring a broader, more marketable perspective. We need to streamline operations and pivot to a lifestyle brand. You are a great floor manager, but you do not have the vision to attract high-end venture capitalists." A great floor manager. He had just reduced my 12 years of executive leadership to sweeping floors. Before I could tear into Julian's complete lack of qualifications, Chloe stepped up beside him, linking her arm through his. "Honestly, Maya, you are always so selfish," she laughed, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "You have always been too bossy and intimidating. Julian is going to make the brand relatable. You should be happy for us instead of trying to ruin our moment. Plus, Daddy is making sure you get to keep your job. You should be grateful you have a secure position on Julian's team." The sheer audacity of her words struck me like a physical blow. Selfish, grateful. I looked at my father, expecting him to correct her, to defend my decade of sacrifice. Instead, Calvin nodded in agreement. "Your sister is right. You need to learn how to be a team player, Maya. Julian is the CEO now. I expect you to support him fully. If you cannot do that, you can hand in your resignation tonight." They were completely serious. They expected me to fall in line, to bow my head, and serve the man who had just stolen my legacy, all to finance my sister's lavish lifestyle and appease my father's obsession with a polished corporate image. Julian reached into his velvet jacket and pulled out a sleek cream-colored folder. He held it out to me, his smirk widening into a full smile. "I took the liberty of drawing up some new operational directives," he said loudly enough for the board members to hear. "We need to trim the fat. I expect you to have these cuts implemented by Monday morning. I look forward to working with you, Maya." I took the folder from his hand. My fingers brushed the heavy cardstock and I flipped it open. The first page was a spreadsheet detailing a massive reduction in operating costs. Julian's new vision involved slashing the health insurance and retirement benefits of the veteran staff, the predominantly African American team of roasters and packagers who had been with us since the beginning. He was planning to cut their wages, reduce their hours, and replace our ethical sourcing model with cheaper, lower-quality suppliers to artificially inflate his profit margins. He was going to gut the soul of my community to fund his executive bonus. Anger, hot and blinding, surged through my veins. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table and walk out the door. But as I looked at Julian's arrogant face, at Chloe's entitled sneer, and at my father's dismissive glare, a strange, absolute calm washed over me. Emotional reactions were what they expected. They wanted me to yell so they could brand me as the angry, difficult black woman. They wanted me to quit so Julian could take full credit for the infrastructure I built. I was not going to give them that satisfaction. I was going to let them dig their own graves. I closed the folder, smoothed my expression into a mask of total neutrality, and looked Julian dead in the eye. "I understand completely," I said, my voice steady and perfectly pleasant. "I will review these directives immediately. Congratulations on your new role, Julian." I turned to my father, giving him a tight, polite nod, and walked back to my seat. I sat down, picked up my glass of sparkling water, and took a slow sip. What my father, my sister, and her new fiancé did not realize as they toasted to their brilliant future was that Crown Roasters was standing on a house of cards that belonged entirely to me. 3 years ago, my father made a disastrous gamble on a massive commercial real estate expansion that failed spectacularly. The bank was days away from foreclosing on our primary roasting warehouse, which would have instantly killed the business. He was too proud to admit his failure to the board. To save him, I emptied my personal savings, liquidated my stock portfolio, and took out a massive personal loan to purchase the warehouse building through a blind limited liability company. I became his anonymous landlord, restructuring the lease to keep Crown Roasters afloat while he recovered. I never told him because I wanted to protect his pride. Furthermore, during that same crisis, our previous lawyers botched the trademark renewals. To protect our intellectual property from competitors, I personally registered and secured the utility patents for our 3 flagship coffee blends, the specific roasts that account for 80% of the company's revenue. I hold those patents solely in my name, licensing them to Crown Roasters at my discretion. Julian thought he had just been handed an empire. In reality, he had just been handed a tenant lease and a license agreement, both of which I could revoke at any second. I watched them celebrate, a genuine smile finally touching my lips as I formulated exactly how I was going to dismantle their perfect delusion piece by piece. Monday morning was going to be an education they would never forget. The sun had barely risen on Monday morning when I pulled my car into the circular driveway of my parents' sprawling estate in Buckhead. The adrenaline from Saturday night's disastrous anniversary gala had settled into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I walked through the heavy mahogany front doors, stepping into the immaculate marble-floored foyer that my sweat blood and late nights had ultimately paid for. I found my mother Vivian sitting in the sunroom. She was sipping her morning coffee from a delicate porcelain cup, scrolling through her tablet with a serene, untroubled smile. I had come seeking a voice of reason. Despite her historical and blatant favoritism toward Chloe, I foolishly hoped that in the quiet light of day, the sheer absurdity of handing a multi-million-dollar logistics empire to an unemployed outsider would finally register with her. I sat across from her and laid it out plainly. I explained that Julian's new directives would completely gut our workforce and compromise the very product that built our family name. Vivian did not even look up from her screen. She took a slow sip of her coffee, waved her hand dismissively in the air, and told me I was wildly overreacting to a standard business transition. She said Julian had a certain prestigious pedigree that we simply did not possess. I moved in exclusive circles with high-end venture capitalists, people who looked like him and inherently trusted him with their money. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering critically on my practical, sensible work clothes. She told me that while my hard work over the last decade was certainly appreciated, I lacked the polish and the social grace necessary to elevate the brand to the next level. She said I was too rigid, too aggressive, and notoriously difficult to work with. I felt all the air leave my lungs. I asked her how she could possibly justify stripping me of my rightful place to elevate a man who had literally bankrupted his own company less than 2 years ago. Vivian set her cup down sharply, the porcelain clinking violently against the glass table. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a harsh, scolding whisper. She told me to swallow my pride and stop being so incredibly selfish. Chloe had finally found a man who could provide her with the luxurious lifestyle she deserved, and it was my absolute primary duty, as her older sister, to ensure that marriage was financially secure. My mother looked me dead in the eye and said my jealousy was deeply unbecoming and embarrassing for the family. She demanded I go to the warehouse, support Julian without complaint, and stop acting like an angry, uncooperative woman before I ruined everything. I stood up without saying another word. The echo chamber of their gaslighting was perfectly sealed. They had convinced themselves that my labor was a renewable resource they could mine indefinitely to fund their golden child's fantasy life. I walked out of her sunroom, leaving her to her delusions, and drove straight to the roasting facility. The warehouse was my only true sanctuary. The moment I stepped onto the active roasting floor, the rich, heavy scent of caramelized coffee beans and hot metal grounded me immediately. The massive industrial roasters hummed with a steady, rhythmic power. Our team was already hard at work, operating like a well-oiled machine. Silas, our head roaster, who had been with us for 20 dedicated years, was meticulously checking the temperature gauges on the primary drum. Miss Vonda was leading the packaging line with her usual warm, commanding presence, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. These people were the true heartbeat of Crown Roasters. They were my people. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy metal doors of the warehouse swung open. Julian walked onto the active floor, wearing a tailored navy suit, a silk pocket square, and expensive Italian leather loafers. He looked utterly ridiculous in a highly industrial environment, where everyone else wore protective gear, heavy denim, and steel-toed boots. He did not bother to introduce himself to the staff or learn a single person's name. Instead, he clapped his hands loudly, demanding that the entire production team stop working and gather around him immediately. Silas wiped his hands on a clean towel and stepped forward respectfully, politely asking Julian to keep his voice down, as they were in the middle of a delicate roasting cycle that required intense concentration. Julian's face immediately tightened with arrogance. He looked at Silas not as an expert craftsman, but as an annoying inconvenience standing in his way. Julian announced that starting today, there would be a brand new standard of corporate efficiency. He pulled out his tablet and read off his new daily production quotas. I stood near the elevated catwalk stairs, listening in absolute disbelief, as Julian demanded a 40% increase in our daily yield. He mandated that the roasting machines run continuously, without their required cooling breaks, and he ordered the packaging team to double their output without authorizing a single cent of overtime pay or hiring additional support staff. It was mathematically impossible. Worse, it was incredibly dangerous. Pushing industrial roasting equipment past its thermal capacity without cooling cycles risked catastrophic life-threatening fires. Forcing an aging packaging crew to double their physical labor would lead to severe repetitive stress injuries and widespread burnout. Silas tried to explain this reality to him. He spoke calmly, using his 2 decades of mechanical expertise to outline exactly why the machines would overheat and ruin the entire batch of expensive beans. Julian cut him off with a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand. He told Silas that he was not interested in hearing lazy excuses from the hired help. He stated loudly that if Silas could not handle the new pace of a modern business, he would gladly find someone much cheaper who could do the job without complaining. The disrespect was palpable and suffocating. The entire warehouse fell dead silent. I saw the intense humiliation flash across Silas's face, a proud, hardworking black man being publicly degraded by an arrogant, unqualified novice who had not earned a single ounce of authority. That was the exact moment I stepped out from the shadows of the catwalk and walked directly into the center of the roasting floor. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute unwavering authority in my tone made the entire room freeze in place. I looked directly at Silas and told him to completely ignore the new quotas. I instructed the floor managers to maintain their current safe production levels and to ensure all machines receive their mandatory scheduled cooling cycles immediately. Julian spun around to face me, his face flushing a deep mottled red. His eyes widened as he realized I was openly defying his orders in front of the entire warehouse staff. He stepped aggressively into my personal space, attempting to use his height to physically intimidate me into submission. He lowered his voice to a threatening hiss and told me I was directly violating a direct mandate from the chief executive officer. He said I was intentionally trying to undermine his authority and sabotage his vision on his very first day in charge. I did not back down a single inch. I held my ground, looked him dead in the eye, and stated clearly that as the chief operations officer, the physical safety of the staff and the structural integrity of the expensive equipment fell entirely under my jurisdiction. I told him his arbitrary quotas were not just ignorant, they were a massive liability risk. I firmly stated that I would never allow him to endanger my people or burn down the facility just to make his initial spreadsheets look appealing to his imaginary investors. Julian's jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle ticked visibly in his cheek. He quickly realized he could not win a technical argument about roasting logistics in front of an audience of seasoned experts. So he resorted to the only desperate weapon my father had given him. He pulled his tablet back up his fingers, tapping aggressively and rapidly against the glass screen. Right there in the middle of the warehouse floor in front of the people I had led for over a decade, he formally wrote me up for gross insubordination. He finalized the disciplinary action and shoved his digital screen toward me so I could clearly see the signature line. He promised me with a smug and deeply vicious smile that he was going to march straight into my father's office and show Calvin exactly how toxic, hostile, and uncooperative I truly was. He swore he would make sure my father knew I was the sole problem preventing the company's grand expansion. I looked down at the digital write-up, then looked back up into his arrogant, triumphant face. I nodded slowly, maintaining perfect, unbreakable composure, and told him to go right ahead. I watched his Italian leather loafers slip slightly on a stray coffee bean as he marched toward the exit, his posture rigid with fury. As he stormed off the floor to run and tattle to my father, a quiet, dangerous thrill settled deep in my chest. Julian genuinely thought he was destroying my career. He had absolutely no idea that his fragile ego and desperate need for control were playing flawlessly into the trap I had already set. The summons came less than 10 minutes later. The warehouse intercom crackled, and my father's administrative assistant requested my immediate presence in the executive suite. I took my time walking up the steel staircase that led to the glass-enclosed offices overlooking the roasting floor. I knew exactly what was waiting for me behind those heavy oak doors. My father had built an impressive office for himself, a stark contrast to the gritty reality of the warehouse below. When I walked in, he was standing behind his massive desk, his face set in a mask of profound disappointment. Julian was lounging in a wingback chair in the corner, radiating the smug satisfaction of a bully who had just successfully hidden behind a teacher. "Close the door." Maya, my father ordered, not bothering to offer me a seat. I closed the heavy door. Julian came to me extremely upset. My father continued, his voice dripping with paternal condescension. "He tells me that on his very first morning you decided to publicly humiliate him in front of the warehouse staff. He tells me you countermanded his operational orders." I looked at my father. "Dad, Julian gave orders that would have permanently damaged our commercial roasters and put the packaging team at severe risk of physical injury," I said calmly. "The quotas he demanded are mathematically impossible. I stepped in to prevent a massive liability." My father slammed his hand flat against the desktop. The loud smack echoed sharply. "Do not speak to me about liability," he snapped. "You do not own this company. You are an employee. Julian is bringing an aggressive growth strategy to Crown Roasters. You have grown entirely too comfortable treating this business like your own personal fiefdom. You are rigid, defensive, and standing in the way of our national expansion because your ego cannot handle taking direction from a man who actually understands the corporate landscape." Julian uncrossed his legs and leaned forward with fake sympathy. "I understand change is difficult, Maya," he said smoothly. "But we are playing in the big leagues now. We cannot let emotional attachments to the staff hold back our profit margins. I need you to be a team player." My father pointed a stern finger at me. "This is your only warning. You will fully train Julian on all of your proprietary supply chain networks. You will hand over every single vendor contact, every distribution route, and every client relationship you have built. You will do it by the end of the week, or I will immediately demote you to a junior logistics role and slash your salary in half." Do I make myself perfectly clear? They wanted to strip mine my brain, take all my industry secrets, and then inevitably push me out the door. The injustice of it burned in my throat. My father was willing to destroy my career and humiliate me just to appease the fragile ego of the man dating his favorite daughter. I looked at the floor for a moment, forcing my shoulders to drop. I deliberately let out a long, defeated sigh, playing the exact role they needed me to play. I looked back up at them, allowing a carefully crafted look of surrender to wash over my face. "You are right," I said softly. "I apologize. I was just feeling defensive about the transition, and I let my stress get the better of me. I should not have questioned Julian's directives in front of the staff. I will have the supply chain networks and the vendor files transferred to your desk by Friday, Julian. I am sorry for being difficult." The transformation in the room was instantaneous. My father visibly relaxed, a victorious smile replacing his scowl. He truly believed he had just successfully disciplined a rebellious child. Julian leaned back in his leather chair, practically glowing with the thrill of his conquered territory. "We appreciate your cooperation," Maya, Julian said magnanimously. I knew you would eventually see reason. I nodded politely, turned on my heel, and walked out of the executive suite. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, the mask of submission vanished. My heart was beating with a steady, lethal rhythm. They wanted my networks. They were going to get absolutely nothing but empty folders and dead ends. I returned to my office at the far end of the hallway, locked the door, and opened my encrypted laptop. The real work was about to begin. Over the next 48 hours, while Julian paraded around the warehouse barking useless orders, I quietly and methodically began dismantling the invisible infrastructure that kept Crown Roasters profitable. I picked up the phone and started making calls to our premium business-to-business clients. These were the owners of luxury boutique hotels, upscale regional grocery chains, and high-end independent cafes across the South. They were all hardworking business owners who only bought from Crown Roasters because they trusted my word and my handshake. I did not badmouth my father or Julian. I simply explained that Crown Roasters was undergoing a turbulent corporate restructuring that would inevitably affect the quality of our products. I told them that I was launching a private holding company, Apex Holdings, and that I could guarantee the same premium, ethically sourced beans under a new label. Because of the intense loyalty I had cultivated over 12 years, every single one of my key accounts agreed to let their current distribution contracts with Crown Roasters expire at the end of the month. They quietly signed new exclusive supply agreements directly with Apex Holdings. Next, I needed to protect my people. I called Silas and Miss Vonda into my office separately after their shifts ended. These two had watched me grow up. I could not leave them vulnerable to Julian's ruthless budget cuts. I explained that massive layoffs were coming and that they needed to trust me completely. I offered them both legally binding guaranteed employment contracts under Apex Holdings, complete with significant raises and the exact same comprehensive health benefits Julian was planning to steal from them. I told them to keep their heads down, endure Julian's arrogance for just a little while longer, and wait for my signal. They signed the contracts without a moment of hesitation, their trust in me absolute and unwavering. While I was silently pulling the foundation out from under the company, Julian was growing increasingly desperate to prove his financial genius. Chloe had been visiting the executive suite daily, loudly discussing the extravagant destination wedding she expected him to pay for. Julian needed cash quickly. He needed to show the board of directors a massive immediate reduction in overhead costs to justify the exorbitant executive bonus he had written into his own contract. He spent Wednesday afternoon aggressively auditing the company ledgers, searching for any expense he could slash. He finally fixated on the most significant monthly outgoing expense we had, the commercial warehouse lease. Late Thursday morning, Julian marched into my office without knocking. He stood in front of my desk, a triumphant gleam in his eye, holding his expensive tablet like a weapon. He wanted an audience for his brilliance, and he had chosen me. "You know, Maya, I have been reviewing the commercial lease agreement you supposedly managed for this building," he said, shaking his head with exaggerated pity. "We are paying at least 30% over current market value. The faceless holding company that owns this property has been absolutely gouging us for 3 years. It is honestly embarrassing that you let my future father-in-law sign this terrible agreement." I kept my hands resting flat on my desk, my expression perfectly neutral. "Apex Holdings has been a very reliable landlord," I replied smoothly. "The industrial zoning permits here are highly specialized. The lease is ironclad, Julian. I strongly advise against antagonizing the property management. They are notoriously strict about their contractual terms." Julian laughed out loud, a harsh, grating sound that bounced off the walls of my office. He leaned over my desk, looking at me like I was a remarkably slow child. "That is exactly your problem, Maya," he sneered. "You think like a middle manager terrified of a contract. I think like a shark. You do not ask a landlord for a rent reduction. You force their hand. I am going to show you how a real executive handles a bad deal." Right there, standing over my desk, Julian opened his email application. He proudly narrated his actions aloud, wanting me to witness his aggressive corporate tactics firsthand. He drafted a deeply hostile, legally binding email addressed directly to the contact portal for Apex Holdings. He typed fiercely, stating that Crown Roasters found the current lease terms predatory and unacceptable. He formally declared that he, as the new chief executive officer, was immediately suspending all future rent payments. He explicitly threatened to withhold rent indefinitely until the landlord agreed to renegotiate the lease and lower the monthly rate by 30%. He was committing a blatant documented breach of commercial contract. He was handing the landlord the legal right to initiate immediate eviction proceedings. "This is how you command respect in the business world," Julian boasted, his finger hovering over the screen. "You cut the oxygen line and you wait for them to suffocate." He hit send. Less than 2 seconds later, my private cell phone vibrated silently inside my blazer pocket. Julian had just proudly and arrogantly delivered a formal breach of contract threat directly into my personal inbox. He had absolutely no idea. He had just handed me the exact legal weapon I needed to destroy him. I looked up at his smug, victorious face and offered him a slow, genuine smile. I told him it was a brilliant strategy and that I could not wait to see how the landlord responded. That was the absolute truth. The landlord was going to respond with overwhelming force, and Julian would never see it coming. As soon as Julian strutted out of my office riding the high of his own manufactured bravado, I calmly stood up and locked my door. The heavy click of the deadbolt felt like a starting gun. I walked back to my desk, opened my personal laptop, and logged into the encrypted email portal for Apex Holdings. There it was. A formal declaration of intent to withhold rent and breach a commercial lease signed by the new chief executive officer of Crown Roasters. Julian had handed me his own execution warrant on a silver platter. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line for my attorney, DeAndre. DeAndre and I had known each other since our undergraduate years. He was a brilliant, razor-sharp corporate litigator who had helped me set up the blind limited liability company 3 years ago when I drained my savings to save my father from bankruptcy. When DeAndre answered, I did not even bother with a greeting. I simply read Julian's email aloud to him word for word. A long, heavy silence stretched across the line before DeAndre let out a low, booming laugh. He asked me if Julian was actually that arrogant or just dangerously incompetent. I told him it was a lethal combination of both, fueled by the unearned confidence my family kept inflating. We wasted no time. I instructed DeAndre to draft a response with cold, absolute corporate precision. We were not going to negotiate. We were not going to issue a polite warning or ask for a meeting. As the landlord, Apex Holdings was going to deliver a formal 30-day notice to cure or quit. The legal document would state that Crown Roasters was in material breach of their commercial lease agreement due to the explicit documented threat of withholding rent. If the total rent, plus a newly activated massive penalty fee for the breach, was not paid in full, within 30 days, Apex Holdings would initiate immediate commercial eviction proceedings. The locks would be changed, the roasting equipment would be seized as collateral, and the business would effectively cease to exist. DeAndre promised to have the document served to the executive suite email accounts by 9 o'clock the following morning. The next day, I arrived at the warehouse early. I poured myself a cup of our signature dark roast and sat at my desk, leaving my office door wide open. The roasting floor below was a symphony of grinding gears and hissing steam, the beautiful noise of my community, hard at work. Miss Vonda and Silas were already running the lines, completely unaware of the corporate earthquake about to strike the building. At precisely 9 o'clock, the silence in the executive suite above me shattered. It started with a muffled shout, followed by the sound of a heavy chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. My father's office was directly above mine, and the sheer volume of his panic vibrated through the ceiling panels. The formal notice to cure or quit had landed in their inboxes. The reality of losing their flagship roasting facility, the physical heart of Crown Roasters, had just hit them with the force of a freight train. I stepped out of my office and looked up at the glass-enclosed suite. Julian was pacing frantically back and forth in front of the windows. I was running his hands through his perfectly styled hair, his face pale and slick with sweat. He had expected the faceless landlord to cower and immediately offer a 30% discount out of fear of losing a tenant. He never anticipated dealing with a ruthless commercial property owner who would call his bluff and move straight to eviction. He had just gambled the entire family legacy on a power trip, and he had lost spectacularly. I watched Julian stop pacing and turn toward my father. Even through the glass, I could read his body language perfectly. The panic in his eyes was rapidly shifting into a desperate, calculated survival instinct. Julian knew he had made a catastrophic blunder. He knew he had just authorized a breach of contract that could bankrupt the company before his tenure even truly began. But a man like Julian, a man accustomed to failing upward and letting others clean up his messes, would never take accountability. He needed a scapegoat. He needed me. I slowly walked up the steel staircase toward the executive suite, timing my arrival perfectly. I paused just outside my father's door, listening as Julian spun a web of frantic lies. Julian's voice was high-pitched and defensive. He was telling my father that the lease agreement was a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. He claimed that the landlord's aggressive response was not because of his email, but because the original contract was fundamentally predatory and deeply flawed from the beginning. Julian boldly stated that whoever negotiated this lease had completely failed to secure basic tenant protections. He used a flurry of corporate buzzwords to confuse the issue, shifting the blame entirely to my supposed mismanagement of the original contract. He told my father that the holding company had clearly been looking for any minor excuse to evict them so they could sell the building to developers, and that my weak contract left them entirely defenseless. He painted himself as the vigilant executive who had simply stumbled upon a massive structural failure that I had been hiding for years. It was a masterful display of gaslighting and shifting blame. He took his own reckless, documented threat to withhold rent and miraculously transformed it into my failure to negotiate a better lease 3 years ago. The sheer audacity of his lies was breathtaking. But what was worse was how eagerly my father swallowed every single word without checking a single record. Before I could even reach for the handle, the oak door flew open. My father stormed out into the hallway, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Julian trailed closely behind him, keeping his head down and arranging his features into a look of deep, sympathetic concern. My father did not ask for my side of the story. He did not ask to review Julian's sent emails or consult with the company's legal counsel to verify Julian's claims. He blindly accepted the word of a man he had known for 8 months over the daughter who had dedicated 12 years of her life to saving his business from ruin. Calvin backed me into the wall of the hallway, his voice a harsh, echoing bark that caused several staff members on the roasting floor below to stop their machines and look up in alarm. He aggressively demanded to know how I could have been so incredibly stupid. He screamed that my gross mismanagement of the commercial lease agreements was about to cost us everything we had built. He accused me of being carelessly and completely incompetent when dealing with the property management firm. Julian stood silently behind my father's shoulder, watching me take the abuse for his catastrophic mistake. The coward did not say a single word in my defense. I kept my voice absolutely even, refusing to give them the emotional reaction they were desperately trying to provoke. I told my father that the lease agreement was standard for this industrial zoning. I reminded him that we had never had a single issue with Apex Holdings until Julian decided to unilaterally threaten them with non-payment just 24 hours ago. My father refused to listen. He waved his hand, cutting me off completely. He told me he did not want to hear my pathetic excuses. He said Julian was right, that my operational failures were a massive liability, and that it was my responsibility to fix the disaster I had supposedly created. He looked at me with a level of disgust that shattered the last remaining illusions I had about our relationship. He did not see me as his daughter or his savior. He saw me as a scapegoat to protect his golden child's future husband. Then my father delivered the ultimate insult. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a menacing growl, and delivered his final mandate. He ordered me to immediately contact the landlord, beg for leniency, and fix the eviction notice. But he did not stop there. He told me that since I was responsible for this mess, I would be the one to pay for it. He aggressively demanded that I pull the necessary funds to cover the massive breach of contract penalty directly from my own operational budget. He was effectively forcing me to cannibalize the payroll, health benefits, and maintenance funds for my hardworking warehouse staff to pay for Julian's arrogant mistake. If I refused to fix the landlord issue and cover the cost of Julian's blunder with my own departmental budget, my father threatened to formally charge me with negligence, strip me of my minority shares, and fire me before the end of the day. I stared right back into my father's furious eyes. The sheer audacity of his demand hung heavily in the stale air-conditioned climate of the executive suite. He actually wanted me to cannibalize my own operational budget to save Julian from the consequences of his catastrophic arrogance. I told him absolutely not. I kept my posture rigid and my voice dangerously low, explaining that the operational budget was strictly allocated for employee salaries, critical machine maintenance, and our raw material sourcing. Diverting those necessary funds to cover a massive commercial lease penalty would completely paralyze our production lines by Tuesday morning. My father slammed his fist against the mahogany wall, his face twisting with a dark, irrational rage. He accused me of being petty, vindictive, and deliberately sabotaging the family legacy out of pure spite because I was jealous of Julian's new position. He leaned into my personal space and delivered his ultimatum. He told me that if I did not authorize the cash transfer to the property management firm by 5 o'clock this afternoon, he would convene an emergency board meeting to formally strip me of my 20% minority shareholder equity. He explicitly threatened to use a corporate bylaws clause regarding executive failure to justify seizing my hard-earned shares to protect the family interests. The profound betrayal felt like a physical strike to my chest. My own father was actively extorting my financial ownership in the company I saved just to cover the tracks of a man he had known for a mere 8 months. I refused to break eye contact. I told him that if he desperately needed emergency capital to fix a commercial lease violation, he could easily pull the funds directly from Julian's massive unearned executive signing bonus. My father's expression darkened further entirely, unwilling to inconvenience his golden child's future husband. He pointed a shaking finger at the heavy oak door and ordered me out of his sight, reiterating that I had until the end of the business day to comply or lose my shares entirely. I walked out of the suite, the heavy threat echoing in my ears. But my resolve was completely unbreakable. I descended the steel staircase back to the main warehouse floor, desperately needing the familiar rhythmic hum of the commercial roasters to clear my head. The peace was immediately shattered by the sharp, echoing sound of designer high heels clicking aggressively against the polished concrete. My younger sister Chloe strutted through the heavy double doors carrying a collection of luxury shopping bags from the most expensive boutiques in the city. She looked entirely out of place on the active industrial floor, completely oblivious to the suffocating tension in the building. Chloe did not know that we were facing an imminent commercial eviction. She only knew that she had a brand new toy to show off to the world. She made a direct line straight for me, ensuring that several of our busy floor managers were forced to step out of her way. She dropped her heavy shopping bags onto a nearby wooden shipping pallet and thrust her left hand directly into my face. Resting heavily on her ring finger was a massive custom-cut diamond engagement ring. The center stone was easily 4 carats flanked by brilliant cut baguettes, set in a thick band of solid platinum. It caught the harsh overhead industrial lighting and threw fractured blinding prisms across the brick walls. Chloe practically squealed with delight, loudly bragging to anyone within earshot about how Julian had specially ordered the diamond from an exclusive appointment-only jeweler in New York. She detailed the flawless clarity the custom cut and made sure to heavily emphasize that the piece cost well into the 6 figures. She looked at me with a triumphant, deeply mocking smile. She said this was exactly what it looked like when a successful man truly valued a woman, and that Julian was finally providing the opulent, luxurious lifestyle she had always deserved. She reached out and patted my arm condescendingly, telling me that maybe if I stopped working so tirelessly and softened my aggressive edges, I could eventually find a man willing to buy me something half as nice. I stared down at the massive diamond glittering aggressively on her finger, but I was not feeling a single ounce of jealousy. I was doing the math. I knew every single decimal point of Crown Roaster's complex financial architecture. I knew exactly what Julian's new executive compensation package entailed. Even with his inflated base salary and his generous signing bonus, there was absolutely no physical way he could afford a 6-figure custom platinum diamond ring out of pocket. He had completely bankrupted his previous tech startup 2 years ago and had zero liquid assets or generational wealth when he started dating my sister. The basic math simply did not add up. A cold, sharp realization began to form in the back of my mind. Julian had loudly and proudly refused to pay the commercial warehouse rent, claiming it was a brilliant strategic negotiation tactic to force the landlord's hand. But what if that was a complete fabrication? What if the aggressive, threatening email he sent to my holding company was just a convenient corporate smokescreen to explain why a massive chunk of operational capital had suddenly vanished from the company ledgers? I offered Chloe a tight, perfectly polite smile, told her the engagement ring was certainly unforgettable, and walked directly toward my office. I stepped inside, locked the heavy door, pulled the privacy blinds completely shut, and opened my encrypted laptop. As the chief operations officer, who had built our digital infrastructure entirely from scratch, I had deep, unrestricted back-end administrative access to the company's private financial servers. I easily bypassed the surface-level accounting software that Julian and my father monitored and dove straight into the raw, unfiltered master ledgers. I needed to see exactly where the company's cash reserves were flowing over the last 48 hours. I pulled up the primary operational accounts and immediately initiated a highly detailed forensic trace on the routing numbers. My eyes scanned the complex rows of digital transactions, searching for any sudden anomalies. It did not take long to find the bleeding wound. Julian had not just withheld the warehouse rent from the property management portal. He had manually diverted the exact dollar amount of the rent, and then he had gone a massive, unforgivable step further. He had accessed the restricted employee payroll account, the specific protected fund designated to pay the wages, overtime, and health insurance premiums of our veteran roasting staff. He had siphoned a massive six-figure sum directly out of the payroll reserves. I tracked the destination routing number of the diverted corporate funds. The money had not been moved into a secure escrow account for lease negotiations as he claimed. It had been wire transferred into an external, anonymous shell company. I ran a quick, comprehensive background query on the shell company's registration details through the public state business records. The managing director of the limited liability company was Julian. The sheer, breathtaking criminality of the act washed over me in a wave of absolute disgust. He was not just arrogant and dangerously incompetent. He was actively and intentionally bleeding my father's company dry. He had stolen the hard-earned wages of the very African-American men and women sweating on the roasting floor outside my office, just to buy my sister a massive diamond ring and finance his own lavish, fake executive lifestyle. He planned to let the warehouse staff miss their paychecks on Friday, while he drank champagne in the executive suite. I carefully downloaded every single digital receipt, every time-stamped wire transfer log, and the specific routing confirmation numbers. I backed the highly sensitive files up to a secure external hard drive and uploaded a secondary encrypted copy to my private cloud server. Julian thought he was a brilliant corporate shark swimming among smaller fish. He had absolutely no idea he was already hopelessly caught in the net. I sat back in my desk chair, staring at the damning evidence glowing brightly on my screen. I did not just have solid proof of his incompetence anymore. I now held the undeniable, heavily documented digital paper trail for federal felony embezzlement. The trap I had laid was closing perfectly around him, and the leverage I held was absolute, unyielding, and completely legally devastating. The reality of the 30-day eviction notice hung over the executive suite like a dark, suffocating storm cloud. For the next 2 days, I watched Julian slowly unravel from the quiet sanctuary of my office. His initial arrogant bluster had completely evaporated, replaced by a frantic, sweaty panic that he could not hide from anyone on the roasting floor. He paced the catwalks, continuously barking irrational orders at the packaging team and snapping at his own administrative assistants. I knew exactly why he was losing his mind. The eviction threat was only the first domino. The end of the fiscal quarter was rapidly approaching, and with it came the mandatory comprehensive financial audit. The independent accounting firm was scheduled to arrive on Monday morning to review the company ledgers. Julian knew that the moment those auditors opened the books, they would immediately notice the massive six-figure hole in the employee payroll account. I knew he could not magically replace the stolen funds he had already spent on Chloe's custom platinum engagement ring and his own extravagant lifestyle. He was backed into a corner of his own making, and a cornered rat will always bite to survive. He needed a victim. He needed someone to take the blame for the missing money before the auditors arrived and uncovered his federal crimes. Through my restricted back-end administrative access, I watched his desperate survival plan unfold in real time. Sitting at my desk, I monitored his digital footprint on the company servers. Julian had locked himself inside his glass-enclosed office, pulling the privacy blinds completely shut. He was aggressively manipulating the secondary accounting software. I watched the cursor move across my screen as he fabricated fake purchase orders and doctored digital invoices. I was meticulously altering the transaction histories, trying to link the diverted payroll funds directly to my operational budget. He was crafting a highly detailed fictional narrative that I had secretly siphoned the employee wages to cover up massive equipment failures and to secretly pay off the commercial lease penalty that I had supposedly mismanaged. It was a clumsy, amateurish attempt at digital forgery, but it was designed perfectly to prey on my father's worst fears and his blind trust in Julian. I sat there drinking my coffee and simply let him do it. I downloaded every single keystroke, every doctored spreadsheet, and every fake invoice he created carefully, adding his active attempt to frame me for corporate fraud to the heavily encrypted external hard drive locked in my desk drawer. I was digging his grave deeper with every click of his mouse, and I was more than happy to hand him the shovel. Late Friday afternoon, the warehouse was winding down for the weekend. The heavy scent of roasted beans was thick in the air, and the floor managers were shutting down the primary cooling trays. The intercom on my desk suddenly buzzed with a sharp, aggressive tone. My father's administrative assistant informed me that my presence was required in the executive suite immediately. She did not ask, she demanded, and her voice trembled slightly, indicating that whatever was happening upstairs was incredibly volatile. I closed my laptop, straightened my blazer, and took a slow, deep breath. The final confrontation was here. I walked out of my office and slowly climbed the steel staircase, my footsteps echoing loudly against the metal grates. I did not feel fear or anxiety. I felt a cold, absolute certainty. I had spent 12 years breaking my back for these people, trying to earn a love and respect that they were fundamentally incapable of giving. Today was the day I finally stopped trying. I pushed open the heavy oak doors to my father's office without knocking. The atmosphere inside the room was heavy and toxic. My father Calvin stood behind his massive mahogany desk, his face a deep, dangerous shade of red. The veins in his neck were visibly bulging, and his fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. Julian stood safely behind him, playing the role of the deeply concerned, reluctant whistleblower. He had his hands clasped respectfully in front of him, and his face was arranged into a perfect mask of tragic disappointment. Sitting on the leather sofa in the corner was my mother Vivian. She wore a tailored designer dress and clutched her expensive handbag tightly against her chest, looking anxiously between my father and the door. Her presence confirmed the severity of the ambush. They had called in the family matriarch to handle the emotional execution. My father did not say a single word of greeting. He simply picked up a thick stack of freshly printed spreadsheets and hurled them violently across his desk. The heavy papers hit the polished wood with a loud smack and scattered across the surface, sliding over the edge and falling onto the carpet at my feet. "Look at them, Maya," my father roared, his voice shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. "Look at the absolute, undeniable proof of your betrayal." I looked down at the scattered papers. They were the exact forged documents I had watched Julian create hours ago. I did not stoop to pick them up. I kept my eyes locked directly on my father, maintaining a posture of total unwavering calm. "What exactly am I looking at, Dad?" I asked, my voice perfectly level. "You are looking at your own criminal incompetence." Julian stepped forward, injecting a tone of deep sorrow into his voice. "I am so sorry, Maya. I really am. When I started reviewing the accounts for the upcoming audit, I found massive irregularities in your department. I tried to look the other way, I really did. But the numbers do not lie. You have been systematically diverting hundreds of thousands of dollars from the employee payroll reserves. You stole from the staff to cover up your operational failures on the roasting floor and to hide the massive financial penalties you triggered with that terrible commercial lease agreement. You bled this company dry to save your own reputation. The sheer audacity of his performance was almost impressive. He spoke with such earnest conviction that anyone who did not know the truth would have believed him instantly. He looked at my father with a pained expression, silently seeking approval for his difficult discovery. My father slammed his hands down on the desk, leaning aggressively toward me. "You stole from me!" he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "You stole from the people you claim to care so much about. You intentionally jeopardized the entire future of this family brand, just because you were too proud to admit you failed. You nearly destroyed your sister's future because you are a jealous, bitter woman." "I did not steal a single dime," I said, keeping my voice low and dangerous. "Those spreadsheets are completely fabricated. If you actually look at the raw routing numbers instead of the garbage Julian just printed out, you would see exactly where that money went." "Do not you dare stand in my office and lie to my face," my father shouted, stepping around the desk to crowd my personal space. "Julian brought me the digital paper trail. The evidence is absolutely ironclad. You are a thief, Maya. You are a disgrace to the Crown Roaster's name, and you are a disgrace to this family." He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a thick legal document, and slammed it onto the desk right over the scattered forged spreadsheets. He pointed a shaking finger at the signature line. "This is the only mercy you are going to get from me," my father snarled. "You are going to sit down right now and sign this ironclad non-compete clause. You are going to formally and permanently surrender your 20% minority equity back to the family trust. You are going to pack your desk, and you are going to resign quietly, effective immediately. If you sign this document and walk away without causing a single problem, I will let you leave with your freedom. If you refuse, I will call the police right now, and I will have my own daughter arrested and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law for corporate theft." The threat hung in the dead silent air of the office. My own father was actively blackmailing me. He was perfectly willing to send his eldest daughter to federal prison based entirely on a lie manufactured by a man he barely knew. He was willing to destroy my entire life just to protect his own ego and avoid admitting he had handed his legacy to a con artist. Before I could even open my mouth to respond, the final crushing blow was delivered not by my father or the man trying to frame me, but by my mother. Vivian stood up from the leather sofa, her high heels clicking softly against the floorboard. She walked over to me, her face pale and drawn with anxiety. She did not look angry, she looked terrified of the social consequences. She reached out and grabbed my forearm, her perfectly manicured fingers digging painfully into my skin. "Maya, please," Vivian whispered, her voice trembling with frantic desperation. "Please just sign the papers and walk away quietly. Do not make this any worse than it already is. Think about what a criminal investigation would do to our reputation in the community. Think about the scandal. Chloe is getting married in 4 months. We cannot have the police dragging you out of the warehouse in handcuffs. It would completely ruin her wedding and humiliate Julian's family. Just take the fall, Maya. Just sign the equity over and disappear for a while. It is the only way to save the family from public embarrassment. Do it for your sister." I looked down at my mother's hand wrapped tightly around my forearm. Her perfectly manicured nails were digging into my skin through the fabric of my blazer. I stared at her face, searching for a single ounce of maternal instinct, a shred of protective love, or basic human decency. There was nothing. I saw only a desperate, image-obsessed woman who was perfectly willing to feed her eldest daughter to the wolves just to ensure her youngest daughter could walk down the aisle with a massive diamond ring. She was actually begging me to accept the blame for a federal crime I did not commit. She wanted me to surrender my 20% equity, my life savings, and my freedom, all to protect a lying outsider who had manipulated his way into our family. I slowly raised my eyes and looked at my father. Calvin stood behind his massive desk, his chest heaving with manufactured outrage. He was a proud black man who had built an empire. Yet he was so blinded by his own ego and his infatuation with Julian's corporate aesthetic that he was ready to throw his own flesh and blood into a prison cell. He would rather destroy my life than admit he had made a catastrophic mistake in trusting Julian. And then I looked at Julian. He was standing slightly behind my father, maintaining his mask of deep, tragic disappointment. But in his eyes I saw the cold, calculating gleam of a predator who believed he had just successfully cornered his prey. He genuinely thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted me, outmaneuvered me, and secured his stolen throne by using my own family as his executioners. In that exact moment, the final fraying thread of my familial loyalty snapped permanently. The 12 years of 80-hour work weeks, the missed holidays, the destroyed personal relationships, the relentless sacrifice I had poured into Crown Roasters simply evaporated from my heart. The immense obligation I felt to protect my father's legacy vanished like smoke. They were not my family anymore. They were simply hostile business liabilities. I deliberately reached down and peeled my mother's fingers off my arm, pushing her hand away with a firm, unmistakable rejection. I took a step back, creating a physical barrier between myself and the three of them. I squared my shoulders and looked directly into my father's furious eyes. "I will not sign a single page of that document," I said, my voice eerily calm and echoing off the walls of the executive suite. "I will not surrender my 20% minority equity to the family trust, and I will absolutely not sign a non-compete clause. You can take those fabricated spreadsheets and burn them because I am not taking the fall for your golden boy's criminal embezzlement." My father's face contorted with pure rage. He slammed his hand on the desk again, the sound cracking like a whip. "I am not playing games with you, Maya," he roared. "If you do not pick up that pen and sign right now, I will pick up this phone and call the police. I will have you escorted out of this building in handcuffs before the staff finishes their shift." I smiled at him. It was a cold, sharp smile that made my mother physically flinch and take a step back. "Then call them, Dad," I challenged, gesturing toward his desk phone. "Call the authorities right now. Let us bring in federal forensic accountants to rip through the company ledgers. Let them trace the exact routing numbers on those missing payroll funds. I would love to see how Julian explains the wire transfers to his anonymous shell company to a judge." "Go ahead, make the call." A flash of genuine terror crossed Julian's face. He knew that an actual police investigation would instantly uncover his amateurish digital forgery and expose his theft. He stepped forward quickly, placing a restraining hand on my father's shoulder, pivoting seamlessly into the role of the merciful peacemaker. "Calvin, wait," Julian said, injecting a tone of urgent caution into his voice. "If we involve the authorities, this becomes a matter of public record. The local media will get hold of the story. The investors will panic. It will destroy the national expansion launch next week. We have to handle this internally to protect the brand. We cannot risk the public scandal over her mistakes." My father hesitated, his obsession with the company's public image immediately overriding his anger. He lowered his hand from the phone, trapped by his own bluff and Julian's desperate manipulation. But he could not back down. His massive ego demanded a victory. He looked at me with absolute, unfiltered contempt. "If you refuse to cooperate, if you refuse to protect this family, then you leave me absolutely no choice," my father said, his voice dripping with venom. "You are no longer welcome in this company. You are a cancer to my legacy. I am formally terminating your employment as Chief Operations Officer effective immediately. You are fired without cause. I want your security badge on my desk right now, and I want you out of this building in 10 minutes. Fired without cause. Those were the exact legal words I needed him to say. I unclipped my security badge from my lapel and tossed it casually onto the scattered forged spreadsheets on his desk. I did not say another word. I turned on my heel and walked out of the executive suite, leaving my mother sobbing quietly on the leather sofa and my father breathing heavily behind his desk. I descended the steel staircase to the roasting floor for the last time. The heavy, beautiful scent of caramelized coffee beans filled my lungs, but I felt no sadness. I felt only the electric thrill of absolute liberation. I walked into my office and pulled a single cardboard box from the supply closet. I did not touch a single company file or proprietary document. I packed only my personal belongings, my framed business degrees, my favorite ceramic coffee mug, and the small potted plant that had sat on my windowsill for a decade. As I was placing the last item into the box, Julian appeared in my doorway. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest, his velvet jacket catching the harsh overhead industrial light. He had followed me downstairs to supervise my exit, desperate to gloat and secure his final victory lap. "You really should have just played along." Maya Julian said, his voice dropping the fake corporate sympathy and revealing the smug, arrogant bully underneath. You could have stayed. You could have collected a nice, quiet paycheck while I took this company to the next level. But you just had to be difficult. You had to try and prove you were the smartest person in the room. And look where it got you. You are walking out the door with absolutely nothing. No job, no legacy, and soon enough, no equity. I won. I picked up the formal termination acknowledgement paper that Human Resources had just hastily printed and delivered to my desk. I picked up my favorite fountain pen and signed my name on the bottom line with a smooth, elegant flourish. I placed the signed document carefully on the center of my desk, ensuring Julian could see it clearly. Then I opened my encrypted laptop one final time. I pulled up the drafted email I had prepared hours ago, addressed directly to my attorney DeAndre. The email contained a single scanned attachment, the formal legally binding notification of my termination without cause signed by my father. I looked up from my screen and met Julian's arrogant, triumphant gaze. I smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile that finally made his smug expression falter. "You are right, Julian," I said softly, my voice perfectly pleasant. "I am walking out the door. But you are about to find out exactly what it means to be the smartest person in the room. Enjoy the new vision." I hit send. The email vanished into the digital ether, completely out of my outbox, and straight to DeAndre's legal desk. I closed my laptop, slid it into my leather briefcase, picked up my cardboard box, and walked right past Julian. I did not look back as I strode across the roasting floor, pushing through the heavy double doors and stepping out into the bright afternoon sunlight. I walked to my car, placed my box in the passenger seat, and drove away from Crown Roasters. What Julian, my father, and my mother were about to discover was the lethal legal mechanism I had hardwired into the company's intellectual property. When I personally paid to register the utility patents for Soul Roast Heritage Blend and Midnight Crown 3 years ago, I did not just grant Crown Roasters a standard licensing agreement. I had my lawyers draft a highly specific, non-negotiable poison pill clause. The legal agreement explicitly stated that my license allowing Crown Roasters to roast, package, and sell those 3 specific coffee blends was entirely contingent on my active employment as an executive officer within the company. If I was ever terminated, dismissed, or forced out of my position without just cause, the licensing agreement was immediately and irrevocably voided. The moment I hit send on that email to DeAndre, he automatically filed the injunction with the state. My termination without cause just legally triggered the withdrawal clause on the patents. Crown Roasters had just permanently lost the legal right to produce, distribute, or profit from their 3 best-selling blends. In his desperate, arrogant attempt to get rid of me and cover up his own theft, Julian had not just fired the chief operations officer, he had just inadvertently stripped Crown Roasters of 80% of its entire product line overnight. The company's worthless, unpatented beans completely legally paralyzed, and Julian was entirely to blame. The weekend after my termination passed in a state of absolute tranquility. I did not spend my Saturday morning responding to frantic supply chain emails or managing crises on the roasting floor. Instead, I sat on the balcony of my condo, drinking a perfect cup of our signature Midnight Crown blend, and watched the Atlanta skyline wake up. My phone remained blissfully silent. Julian and my father were likely too busy celebrating their perceived victory to notice the lethal legal landmines ticking quietly under their feet. But Monday morning brought the confirmation I was waiting for. I sat in the sleek downtown office of my attorney, DeAndre, reviewing the finalized paperwork. DeAndre handed me a manila folder with a sharp, satisfied smile. The state had officially processed the injunction. Crown Roasters was now legally prohibited from roasting, packaging, or selling any of the 3 coffee blends that accounted for 80% of their revenue. The intellectual property was locked down tight. Furthermore, the 30-day cure period for the commercial warehouse eviction was rapidly expiring. By all standard business metrics, the company was in a total catastrophic freefall. However, my father and Julian were operating in a reality entirely of their own making. DeAndre had spent the weekend tapping into his corporate network to monitor Julian's next moves. What he discovered was a level of arrogant delusion that genuinely stunned me. Julian had not halted operations to address the looming eviction. He had not panicked over the sudden loss of the patent licenses. In fact, he had completely buried the eviction notice and the patent withdrawal from the board of directors. Instead, he decided to double down on his own fabricated genius. Julian had leveraged the sterling pristine financial reputation I had spent 12 years building for Crown Roasters to fraudulently secure massive commercial lines of credit. He took out millions of dollars in aggressive high-interest loans from out-of-state venture capitalists who had no idea the company was facing imminent structural collapse. Julian and my father were using that newly acquired debt to host a lavish, highly publicized investor luncheon at the Four Seasons Hotel in Midtown. Their goal was to formally announce a nationwide expansion of the Crown Roasters brand. They planned to stand in front of industry leaders, local media, and venture capitalists to sell them on a spectacular lie. Julian wanted to cement his position as the brilliant new chief executive officer, while my father wanted to bask in the glory of a national footprint. They were going to celebrate spending millions of dollars they did not have to expand a company that no longer owned its own building or its own products. Chloe, of course, was thrilled. She had been posting nonstop on social media about her fiancé's visionary leadership, entirely oblivious to the fact that he was constructing a massive financial crater that would swallow our family whole. I looked across the desk at DeAndre and told him it was time to end the charade. If I allowed Julian to publicly announce this expansion and secure more investor capital, the resulting fraud investigation would permanently destroy the Crown Roasters' name. I had to cut the cord before he could drag my legacy into a federal financial scandal. DeAndre nodded in agreement. He handed me a thick leather briefcase containing certified copies of every single piece of evidence we had gathered. Inside were the formal eviction papers, the patent withdrawal confirmations, and the undeniable digital paper trail proving Julian had embezzled the employee payroll funds. We had everything we needed to execute a flawless corporate slaughter. On Wednesday afternoon, I prepared for the investor luncheon with the meticulous focus of a general going to war. I did not wear the practical, sensible work clothes my mother had so heavily criticized. I chose a striking tailored crimson suit that commanded immediate attention. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and sleek black heels. I styled my hair perfectly, applied my makeup with sharp precision, and looked at myself in the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at me was not the obedient scapegoat who had spent a decade shrinking herself to appease her father's ego. She was the sole owner of Apex Holdings. She was a self-made millionaire and the rightful architect of the Crown Roasters empire. I picked up the heavy leather briefcase and walked out the door feeling absolutely invincible. The atmosphere at the Four Seasons Hotel was electric with corporate anticipation. The grand ballroom had been rented out entirely for the Crown Roasters expansion announcement. I walked through the opulent lobby, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floors. When I reached the entrance to the event space, two large private security guards in dark suits immediately stepped forward to block my path. They held up their hands, barring me from the double doors. The head of security, a stern-looking man with an earpiece, looked at a digital guest list on his tablet and informed me that this was a private corporate event. He stated firmly that my name was not on the approved media or investor registry, and that Julian had left explicit strict instructions that no uninvited personnel were allowed inside the ballroom. I did not argue or raise my voice. I simply opened my leather briefcase and pulled out a single notarized legal document. I handed it directly to the head of security and maintained steady, unyielding eye contact. I told him in a quiet voice that he needed to read the top paragraph very carefully. I informed him that I was Maya, the former chief operations officer, and a current legal 20% minority shareholder of the company hosting this event. I explained that under state corporate law, it was highly illegal to physically bar a vested equity partner from an open investor briefing. I politely suggested that if he did not step aside immediately, my attorney would file a massive civil rights and corporate obstruction lawsuit against the hotel and his security firm before the appetizer course was served. The security guard scanned the legal seal on the document. He looked at my calm, unwavering expression and quickly calculated that whatever he was being paid by Julian was not worth a personal lawsuit. He handed the paper back to me, offered a curt nod, and stepped aside, gesturing for his partner to open the heavy double doors. I slipped the document back into my briefcase and walked right past them, stepping from the quiet hallway into the vibrant, bustling energy of the grand ballroom. The room was packed to absolute capacity. Over 200 of the most influential industry leaders, venture capitalists, and local media representatives sat at elegantly decorated round tables. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated, silently pouring expensive champagne and serving plates of seared salmon. The lighting was dimmed over the audience, focusing entirely on the brightly illuminated stage at the front of the room. A massive digital screen stretched across the back wall, displaying the Crown Roasters logo in crisp high definition. It was the perfect luxurious setting for a massive corporate lie. I remained standing near the back doors, hidden in the shadows of the dimmed room, taking in the scene. Sitting at the highly visible front table right at the edge of the stage were my parents and my sister. My mother, Vivian, wore a stunning emerald dress beaming with an aggressive, performative pride as she chatted with a wealthy investor to her left. My father sat beside her, looking incredibly validated, his chest puffed out as he soaked in the prestige of the room. Chloe sat on his right, wearing her massive diamond engagement ring prominently on her hand, constantly adjusting her hair so the photographers could catch her best angle. They looked like the absolute picture of a successful modern dynasty. Up on the stage, Julian was in his element. He held a sleek presentation remote in one hand, pacing confidently back and forth across the platform. He was wearing an expensive charcoal suit without a tie, projecting the casual, brilliant energy of a tech visionary. He was currently delivering a highly rehearsed, passionate keynote speech about the future of the brand. He clicked the remote and a new slide appeared on the massive screen behind him, showing a projected map of the United States, completely covered in tiny gold crowns. Julian spoke smoothly into his headset microphone, telling the captivated audience that Crown Roasters was no longer just a regional coffee supplier. He promised them that under his new executive leadership, the company was poised to dominate the national market within the next 12 months. He confidently threw out wildly inflated revenue projections and promised unprecedented returns on their investments. He was selling them a ghost ship, and they were eagerly buying tickets for the voyage. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. The moment of execution had arrived. I gripped the handle of my leather briefcase, adjusted my crimson blazer, and stepped out of the shadows. I walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle of the ballroom, moving straight toward the brightly lit stage. The sound of my heels echoed beneath Julian's amplified voice. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the man who had tried to steal my life as I prepared to burn his illusion to the ground. I did not stop walking until I reached the very edge of the elevated stage. The heavy rhythmic click of my heels finally caught Julian's attention. He paused mid-sentence, lowering his presentation remote as he looked down at me. His arrogant smile faltered, replaced instantly by a tight, warning glare. He leaned toward his lapel microphone, his voice echoing through the grand ballroom with forced, condescending politeness. He told me that I was interrupting a closed corporate briefing and requested that security escort the confused former employee back to the lobby. I ignored him completely. I climbed the short flight of carpeted stairs at the side of the stage and walked directly to the secondary podium. I picked up the spare microphone, turned it on, and looked out over the sea of 200 wealthy investors, venture capitalists, and media representatives. "Good afternoon, everyone," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the massive room. "For those who do not know me, my name is Maya. I am a 20% legal equity partner of Crown Roasters, and until last Friday, I was the chief operations officer who spent 12 years building the very infrastructure you are being asked to invest in today." A murmur rippled through the audience. At the front table, my father half stood from his chair, his face flushing a deep, dangerous purple. My mother grabbed his arm, looking around frantically at the investors, terrified of the public scene unfolding. Julian stepped toward me, his face twisting with genuine panic, and aggressively hissed at me to turn off the microphone before I ruined everything. I did not even look at him. I kept my eyes on the lead investor sitting at the center table. Julian has just presented a beautiful, ambitious plan for a nationwide expansion. I continued, my tone perfectly conversational. However, scaling a brand to a national level is incredibly difficult when you no longer have a commercial facility to roast your coffee in. I raised my left hand in the air. At the back of the ballroom, two men in sharp gray suits pushed through the heavy doors. They were process servers my attorney DeAndre had hired specifically for this moment. They walked briskly down the center aisle, bypassing the confused waitstaff, and approached the front table where my father was standing. They handed two thick, legally sealed envelopes directly to Calvin and Julian. Julian ripped his envelope open, his hands shaking violently as he scanned the first page. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly ashen gray. I leaned into my microphone. What the new chief executive officer is currently reading is a formal commercial eviction notice, I announced to the silent, captivated room. 3 years ago, when Crown Roasters was facing total bankruptcy, I personally liquidated my life savings to buy our primary roasting warehouse through a blind limited liability company called Apex Holdings. I became the anonymous landlord to save this family business. Last week, Julian sent a highly aggressive, documented email directly to my holding company, threatening to illegally withhold rent indefinitely. Because of his reckless breach of contract, the 30-day cure period has expired. Crown Roasters is officially being evicted. The ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and loud whispers. My father stared at the eviction papers in his hands, his mouth opening and closing in absolute shock as the reality of my words finally penetrated his ego. He looked up at me, the betrayal and horror warring on his face. But Julian was a cornered rat, and he immediately tried to spin a desperate web of lies to save his audience. He grabbed his microphone, his voice pitching high with panic. "Do not listen to a single word she is saying," he shouted to the investors. "This is a minor real estate dispute. We are simply transitioning to a larger facility. The building does not matter. The true value of Crown Roasters is our legendary recipes. Our brand loyalty is built entirely on our flagship blends." I smiled at him. It was a cold, surgical smile that completely shattered his remaining bravado. I nodded to a group of DeAndre's legal assistants waiting in the wings. They swiftly moved through the tables, distributing sleek manila folders directly to the major venture capitalists and industry journalists. "Julian is absolutely right," I said, projecting my voice over the rising din of the ballroom. "The true value of Crown Roasters is our intellectual property." Which brings me to my second point. 3 years ago, the corporate legal team failed to file the mandatory trademark renewals. To protect the company from competitors, I personally registered and secured the utility patents for Soul Roast Heritage Blend and Midnight Crown. I own those specific temperature curves and ingredient ratios solely in my name. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the room. The investors were hurriedly opening the manila folders, their eyes widening as they read the legal documents inside. "I licensed those patents back to Crown Roasters on a highly specific contract," I continued. The legal agreement contained a strict poison pill clause. My license allowing this company to produce and sell its 3 best-selling blends was entirely contingent on my active employment as an executive officer. Last Friday afternoon, my father chose to formally terminate me without cause to protect Julian. The moment he fired me, he legally triggered the withdrawal clause. Crown Roasters no longer owns the rights to 80% of its product line. The wealthy venture capitalist sitting directly in front of my father slammed his hand down on the table. He loudly demanded to know if what I was saying was true. He wanted to know if Julian had just asked him for a $50 million expansion investment for a company that did not own a building or its own coffee. My father stood frozen, physically unable to answer, his entire legacy turning to dust in front of his eyes. Julian was hyperventilating now. He gripped the edges of his podium, sweat beading on his forehead, his corporate aesthetic completely destroyed. He leaned into the microphone, his voice shaking with pure desperation. "She is a disgruntled, bitter former employee," he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She is trying to sabotage this company because she was caught stealing. We fired her because she was actively embezzling funds from the operational budget." I let out a slow, deliberate laugh. It was the moment I had been waiting for. I reached into my blazer pocket, pulled out a small encrypted flash drive, and plugged it directly into the master presentation laptop sitting on my podium. I bypassed Julian's slide deck and mirrored my screen to the massive digital projector behind us. The glowing map of the United States vanished. It was instantly replaced by the raw, unfiltered master financial ledgers of Crown Roasters. "I do not steal from my own people. I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous absolute tone that commanded total silence in the room. But I know exactly who does. I highlighted a specific row of digital transactions on the massive screen, blowing up the numbers so every single investor in the back row could see them clearly. I directed the audience's attention to the employee payroll account. I explained that this specific protected fund was designated to pay the wages and health insurance premiums of our veteran, predominantly African American roasting staff. Then I highlighted the massive six-figure withdrawal Julian had initiated just days ago. I tracked the routing number across the screen, showing the exact time-stamped wire transfer, moving the stolen employee wages directly into an external anonymous shell company. I clicked to the next document displaying the state business registration records. The managing director of that shell company was listed in bold, undeniable print: Julian. I turned to look directly at my sister Chloe, who was sitting at the front table, her face a mask of absolute horror. I pointed to the massive custom-cut platinum diamond ring glittering on her left hand. Julian did not just bankrupt his previous tech startup, I announced to the room. He actively committed federal felony embezzlement to cover up his own commercial lease blunders and to finance his extravagant lifestyle. He stole the hard-earned wages of the men and women sweating on the roasting floor just to buy my sister that six-figure engagement ring. The digital paper trail is right there on the screen, and certified copies have already been forwarded to the federal authorities. The ballroom exploded into absolute uncontrollable chaos. The polite corporate atmosphere shattered completely. Venture capitalists shot up from their chairs, pulling out their cell phones and frantically dialing their legal teams. The lead investor at the front table threw his napkin onto his plate, looked my father dead in the eye, and loudly declared that his firm was pulling every single cent of their funding immediately. He demanded a full forensic investigation and promised a massive fraud lawsuit. Journalists were snapping photos of the projected bank records, capturing the exact moment the Crown Roasters dynasty collapsed. My mother buried her face in her hands, weeping hysterically, as her pristine social reputation was publicly and brutally eviscerated. Chloe stared at her heavy diamond ring as if it had suddenly caught fire, her breathing shallow and erratic as the reality of her fiancé's criminal actions set in. My father stood utterly paralyzed, looking back and forth between the damning evidence on the screen and the mass exodus of investors fleeing the ballroom. Julian completely lost his mind. Cornered, humiliated, and facing imminent federal prison time, the polished corporate visionary vanished entirely. He abandoned the podium and lunged across the stage toward me, his face twisted in a feral, violent panic. He screamed into his headset microphone, his voice cracking and echoing wildly over the sounds of the panicked crowd. He yelled that it was all a fabricated lie, that the patents and the building legally belonged to the family trust, and that I was a manipulative, jealous hacker. He pointed a shaking, frantic finger at my face and screamed at the hotel security guards standing by the doors. "Call the police!" Julian shrieked, spit flying from his lips. "Call the police right now. Arrest her. She is committing corporate espionage. She hacked the servers. Lock her up." I stood perfectly still, my hands resting calmly on the edges of the podium, watching him completely self-destruct. I looked at the security guards, who were making no move to approach me, and then I looked back at Julian's sweaty, desperate face. I smiled, savoring the absolute spectacle of his ruin, completely prepared for the legal slaughter that was about to follow. The hotel security guards did not call the police. When the chaotic dust of the investor luncheon finally settled, the local authorities who did arrive took one look at my certified ownership documents, my legal equity partnership, and the massive federal fraud evidence playing on loop across the projector screen, and immediately declared it a civil matter. They politely advised Julian to contact his attorney. I was left standing on the empty stage, shivering in his sweat-soaked velvet jacket, surrounded by the debris of his shattered expansion launch. But the absolute delusion of the men in my family ran deep. Instead of retreating and begging for mercy, my father and Julian decided to double down. 3 days later, the battlefield shifted from the opulent ballroom of the Four Seasons to the cold, sterile, glass-enclosed conference room of DeAndre's high-rise law firm in downtown Atlanta. It was time for the emergency deposition. I sat at the long mahogany table, wearing a crisp charcoal suit, my hands folded neatly in front of me. DeAndre sat to my right, projecting the calm, lethal energy of an apex predator, waiting for the cage to open. Across from us sat my father, Julian, and a team of 3 incredibly expensive, aggressive corporate defense attorneys they had likely hired using the last remaining lines of company credit. My father refused to look me in the eye. He sat with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw set in a rigid line of pure, stubborn pride. He was still desperately clinging to the belief that I was the villain, the ungrateful daughter who had maliciously orchestrated a public spectacle just to embarrass him. Beside him, Julian was attempting to project an aura of untouchable confidence. He had traded his trendy velvet jacket for a conservative navy suit, trying to look like a serious executive who was simply dealing with a rogue employee. The lead defense attorney, a silver-haired man with a booming voice and a condescending sneer, wasted absolutely no time. He leaned aggressively over the polished table and immediately launched into a vicious, calculated attack against my character. He told DeAndre that my actions at the hotel were a blatant, actionable display of corporate sabotage driven entirely by emotional instability and professional jealousy. He loudly declared that I had intentionally destroyed a $50 million capital investment simply because I was bitter about losing my executive title. I did not blink. I let the man exhaust his aggressive vocabulary, knowing that his entire opening argument was built on a foundation of sand. Julian, emboldened by his lawyer's aggressive posturing, decided it was time to play his winning hand. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of printed emails. He slid them across the mahogany table with a deeply arrogant, triumphant smile. He looked directly at me and told the room that he had spent the last 72 hours conducting a deep forensic dive into my operational emails. He announced that he had uncovered the exact mechanism of my supposed betrayal. According to Julian, I had not saved the company 3 years ago. I had robbed it. Julian confidently explained to his legal team and to my father that the printed emails proved I had illegally siphoned company operational budgets into my blind holding company, Apex Holdings. He claimed I had used my father's own corporate revenue to purchase the commercial warehouse, effectively stealing the real estate right out from under the brand. He aggressively accused me of breaching my fiduciary duty, committing gross financial fraud, and unlawfully holding the company hostage with a property I bought using their own money. My father nodded vigorously along with this fabricated narrative, his face lighting up with a sudden, desperate relief. This was the excuse Calvin had been praying for. It completely absolved his bruised ego. If I was a thief, then his decision to fire me and replace me with Julian was entirely justified. My father looked at me with pure disgust, loudly demanding that I sign over the deed to the warehouse immediately and drop the patent withdrawals, or they would hand those internal emails straight to a federal prosecutor. I did not defend myself. I did not even look at the stack of papers Julian had slid across the table. I simply turned my head and gave DeAndre a slow, imperceptible nod. DeAndre smiled. It was a terrifying, brilliant smile. He picked up Julian's printed emails between 2 fingers, glanced at the top page for less than a second, and casually tossed them into the center of the table like trash. He then reached into his own heavy briefcase. DeAndre pulled out a massive, securely bound stack of certified watermarked bank records. He slid the heavy file directly in front of the lead defense attorney. DeAndre's voice was smooth, resonant, and completely devoid of mercy. He told Julian's legal team that before they threatened his client with federal prosecution, they might want to learn the difference between a real bank routing number and a clumsily doctored spreadsheet. DeAndre systematically dismantled Julian's entire narrative. He opened the certified records and traced every single dollar used to purchase the commercial warehouse 3 years ago. He showed the exact time-stamped transactions where I had liquidated my personal retirement portfolios. He showed the withdrawal slips from my private savings accounts. He showed the heavily documented approval forms for a massive personal bank loan I had secured entirely on my own individual credit. DeAndre looked dead into Julian's panic-stricken eyes and clearly stated that there was not a single cent of corporate revenue involved in the real estate acquisition. He informed the defense attorneys that the emails Julian had just presented were laughably amateurish digital forgeries created after the fact, in a desperate criminal attempt to frame a vested equity partner. He warned the silver-haired lawyer that submitting those fabricated documents in a legal proceeding would result in immediate disbarment and severe federal penalties for everyone involved. The defense attorney went completely pale. He looked down at the certified bank records, instantly recognizing the indisputable airtight proof of my sole ownership. He shot a furious, panicked glare at Julian, realizing his client had just lied to him, and handed him fabricated evidence. But DeAndre was not even close to being finished. The complete destruction of their legal argument was just the opening act. DeAndre reached back into his briefcase and pulled out a second thinner file. He slid this one directly across the table to my father. Calvin looked down at the closed folder, a sudden deep apprehension washing over his features. DeAndre informed the room that since Julian was so incredibly eager to discuss the financial history of Crown Roasters from 3 years ago, we should ensure the entire legal record was perfectly accurate and fully transparent. My father opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside were the highly confidential hidden financial records from the exact month the warehouse was purchased. DeAndre's voice cut through the silent room like a scalpel. He detailed exactly how my father had made a catastrophic, unvetted commercial real estate gamble that failed spectacularly. He pointed to the documents proving that Calvin was exactly 72 hours away from facing total personal and corporate bankruptcy. DeAndre made it agonizingly clear to everyone in the room, including Julian and the high-priced defense lawyers, that my father had driven his own legacy directly into a brick wall. DeAndre stated that I was not a thief. I was the absolute sole entity that had kept Crown Roasters breathing. I had sacrificed my own financial future to act as a silent shield, protecting a man whose pride was so fragile he could not even admit his own failures to his board of directors. I watched my father read the documents. I watched the last remaining shreds of his inflated ego collapse entirely. The realization that his golden boy had just publicly exposed the very bankruptcy I had worked so hard to hide from him broke my father in half. He sank back into his leather chair, the fight completely draining out of his body. He was thoroughly, humiliatingly defeated. The room was dead silent, save for the sound of Julian's rapid, shallow breathing. The defense attorneys were frantically packing their notes, clearly preparing to advise their clients to surrender immediately. But my legal team was not there to negotiate a surrender. We were there to execute a total corporate severance. DeAndre leaned forward, his massive frame dominating the center of the mahogany table. He picked up one final thick manila folder from the floor beside him. He did not slide this one to my father. He slid it directly across the polished wood until it stopped exactly an inch away from the lead defense attorney's hands. DeAndre looked directly at Julian, whose face was now a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. DeAndre calmly announced that the folder contained the formal drafts of the federal indictments currently being prepared against Julian for extensive wire fraud and the criminal embezzlement of the employee payroll accounts. The lead defense attorney opened the manila folder with trembling hands. The sterile fluorescent lights of the conference room reflected off the glossy, certified financial documents inside. He read through the first few pages of the drafted federal indictments, and his silver hair seemed to lose its luster instantly. As a seasoned corporate litigator, he knew exactly what he was looking at. I was looking at a bulletproof digital paper trail compiled by federal investigators detailing explicit wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate embezzlement. The documents clearly mapped out the exact IP addresses tying the illegal payroll transfers directly to Julian's personal laptop. The attorney closed the folder, slowly pushing it away from himself, as if the cardboard was physically contagious. He turned to Julian and leaned away, creating a visible physical distance between himself and his client. He told Julian in a hushed, urgent whisper that he could no longer defend him against these specific charges and strongly advised him to retain specialized criminal defense counsel immediately. Julian stared at his lawyer, completely paralyzed. The arrogant tech visionary persona he had worn like armor evaporated into thin air, leaving behind a terrified small man facing the absolute destruction of his life. He began to hyperventilate. His chest heaved and sweat poured freely down the sides of his face, soaking the collar of his expensive dress shirt. Julian knew the severity of federal sentencing guidelines. I knew that stealing a six-figure sum from a corporate payroll account carried a mandatory minimum of 10 to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. He looked across the table at me, searching for a shred of the obedient scapegoat he thought he could manipulate. He found nothing but my cold, unwavering stare. Realizing he could not intimidate me, and that his own high-priced lawyers were abandoning ship, Julian turned his desperate, panicked eyes toward my father. Calvin was still slumped in his leather chair, utterly shattered by the public exposure of his own hidden bankruptcy and the realization that his company was completely worthless. Julian needed a lifeline. He needed a powerful executive to shield him from the crushing weight of the federal government. But my father had absolutely nothing left to give. Calvin looked at Julian with deep, venomous disgust. My father finally understood that he had handed his legacy to a parasitic con artist who had systematically looted the remaining cash reserves. Calvin pointed a shaking finger at Julian and told him that he was entirely on his own. My father declared loudly that the family trust would not pay a single cent toward Julian legal defense, and that he would personally testify against him to protect the Crown Roaster's name. That was the exact moment the rat decided to turn. Julian shot up from his chair violently tipping backward and crashing onto the hardwood floor. The sudden explosive sound made everyone in the room flinch. Julian slammed his hands down on the mahogany table, his face contorting into a mask of pure feral desperation. He pointed directly at my father and screamed at the top of his lungs for the court reporter to document his exact words. Julian loudly and frantically declared that he did not act alone. He swore under oath that he had never intended to divert the employee payroll funds. He spun a wild, desperate narrative claiming that Calvin had specifically ordered him to doctor the operational ledgers. Julian screamed that my father was secretly drowning in massive personal debt and had forced Julian to siphon the money to cover up Calvin's own catastrophic financial failures. He told the room that Calvin was the mastermind behind the entire embezzlement scheme and that my father had explicitly promised to protect him if the auditors ever found out. My father's face flushed a dangerous, vibrant purple. He surged to his feet, roaring over the conference table, calling Julian a pathetic, lying thief. Calvin demanded the court reporter strike those baseless accusations from the record, but Julian refused to back down. He continued to scream, pulling at his own hair, claiming that the toxic workplace culture and the immense pressure from my father had forced his hand. He promised to fully cooperate with federal prosecutors and testify against Calvin to secure a plea deal for himself. The two men who had conspired just days ago to send me to federal prison to protect their own egos were now viciously tearing each other to pieces in a recorded deposition. They were actively feeding each other to the wolves in a desperate bid for self-preservation. I sat back in my chair, crossed my arms, and watched the glorious bloodbath unfold without saying a single word. Sitting in the corner of the conference room, Chloe had been observing the proceedings in stunned silence. The reality of the situation finally breached the thick walls of her lifelong privilege. The man she had paraded around as her brilliant, wealthy savior was currently screaming like a cornered animal, trying to send her beloved father to federal prison. Chloe stood up, her designer dress trembling around her knees. She rushed forward, grabbing Julian's arm and pleading with him to stop talking. She begged him to calm down, telling him that her father would fix this, and that they just needed to stick together as a family. Julian ripped his arm out of her grasp with a violent, dismissive jerk. He turned to my younger sister, his eyes filled with pure, unadulterated contempt. He told Chloe to shut her mouth. He screamed that he was not going to spend the next 2 decades rotting in a federal penitentiary for her bankrupt, incompetent family. He explicitly told her that he had only tolerated her annoying high-maintenance behavior because he thought she was attached to a thriving coffee empire. He systematically stripped away every illusion of their perfect romance, making it agonizingly clear that he had never loved her. He had only ever viewed her as a convenient stepping stone to an executive title and a corporate bank account. Chloe let out a sharp, shattered gasp. She looked down at the massive custom-cut platinum diamond ring resting heavily on her left hand. The beautiful jewel she had flaunted in my face just days ago was no longer a symbol of devotion. It was stolen property purchased with the hijacked wages of hardworking people, and it was now the primary physical evidence of a federal felony. The weight of that realization hit her all at once. Chloe collapsed onto the floor of the conference room, burying her face in her hands and breaking down into hysterical, ugly, heaving sobs. The perfect engagement, the lavish lifestyle, and her golden child immunity shattered completely into a million unrecoverable pieces. Julian defense attorneys quickly stepped in, grabbing him by the shoulders and physically hauling him out of the conference room to prevent him from self-incriminating any further. Julian kicked and screamed the entire way down the hallway, his voice echoing frantically until the elevator doors finally closed. My father stood paralyzed, staring at the empty space where his chosen successor had just stood, while his favorite daughter sobbed inconsolably on the floor at his feet. DeAndre calmly closed his briefcase, the heavy golden clasps snapping shut with a sound of absolute finality. He looked at my father and formally announced that the deposition was concluded. He advised Calvin to hire the best bankruptcy attorneys he could find because the storm was only just beginning. I stood up, smoothed the lapels of my charcoal suit, and walked out of the room, leaving my family to drown in the toxic wreckage they had built for themselves. The fallout over the next several weeks was swift, brutal, and entirely comprehensive. The corporate execution I had set in motion played out exactly as I had predicted. Without the legal rights to produce Soul Roast Heritage Blend or Midnight Crown, the company lost 80% of its product line overnight. The major grocery chains and boutique hotels immediately canceled their massive standing orders. When the investors pulled their $50 million expansion funding, Crown Roasters defaulted on the exorbitant high-interest loans Julian had fraudulently secured. Within 14 days, the company was completely unable to meet its financial obligations. The board of directors held an emergency meeting and formally voted to dissolve the entity. Crown Roasters filed for Chapter 7, bankruptcy, liquidating whatever meager assets remained. The business my father had built and subsequently destroyed officially ceased to exist. But the financial devastation did not stop at the corporate level. My father, in his blind, arrogant confidence, had legally secured Julian massive business loans using his own personal assets as collateral. When the company defaulted, the creditors came directly for Calvin and Vivian. The banks moved with ruthless efficiency. They seized my parents' sprawling multi-million-dollar estate in Buckhead. They repossessed the luxury vehicles my mother loved to show off at her country club luncheons. They froze and drained the remaining personal bank accounts to satisfy the outstanding corporate debts. Everything my mother had valued, every status symbol she used to make me feel small, was systematically ripped away from her. As for Julian, the federal authorities moved quickly. The digital paper trail I provided was absolute perfection. He was arrested at his luxury apartment and formally indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and corporate sabotage. He was denied bail and sat in a federal holding cell, awaiting a trial he was guaranteed to lose. I sat in my spacious office at my newly acquired warehouse late one Thursday evening. A heavy torrential thunderstorm was raging outside, rattling the industrial windows and washing the Atlanta streets clean. I was reviewing the highly profitable distribution contracts for my new independent brand, feeling a profound, deep sense of peace. I had won. I had protected my people, secured my financial future, and completely severed the dead weight of my toxic family. I glanced up at the live security feed broadcasting from the cameras, monitoring my private commercial driveway. Through the grainy black and white footage distorted by the heavy sheets of driving rain, I saw a beat-up, aging sedan slowly pull up to my front security gate. The car looked entirely out of place in the industrial park. The driver's side door opened, and a figure stepped out into the pouring rain without an umbrella. I watched the screen closely as the figure walked toward the camera. It was my father. His shoulders slumped, his expensive suit ruined by the storm. The passenger doors opened, and two more figures emerged, huddling together against the wind. It was my mother Vivian and my sister Chloe. Stripped of their wealth, their mansion, their social status, and their golden child future, my family had absolutely nowhere else to go. They were standing in the freezing rain at the gates of my property, seeking sanctuary from the daughter they had tried to throw away. I stood up from my desk, leaving the highly profitable distribution contracts for my new independent brand glowing on the computer screen. The heavy torrential thunderstorm continued to rage outside violently, washing the Atlanta streets and hammering against the thick industrial roof of my warehouse. I walked out of my office and descended the steel staircase to the main roasting floor. The facility was quiet at this late hour, the massive roasting drums cool and clean, waiting for my loyal staff to return in the morning. I walked straight toward the heavy glass security doors at the front entrance. Through the reinforced panes, I watched the three of them approach. My father, Calvin, my mother, Vivian, and my sister, Chloe, stood shivering under the harsh glare of the yellow security lights. They were completely soaked to the bone. The driving rain had plastered their hair to their faces and ruined their clothes. They did not look like the untouchable, arrogant royalty of the Buckhead elite anymore. They looked exactly like what they were: broken, bankrupt, and desperate. I unlocked the deadbolt and pushed the heavy glass door open just wide enough to stand in the threshold. I remained standing on the dry, warm concrete of my warehouse floor. I did not step out into the storm, and I absolutely did not invite them inside to seek shelter. I simply stood there, my posture perfectly straight, and waited for them to speak. My father looked up at me. The man who had proudly fired me, who had aggressively threatened to send me to federal prison just weeks ago now, possessed the posture of a beaten dog. His shoulders were hunched against the biting wind. The expensive tailored suit he wore was completely saturated, sagging heavily against his diminished frame. He opened his mouth, his jaw trembling violently from the cold, and attempted to muster a weak, pathetic version of his former commanding tone. "Maya, please," my father said, his voice cracking and barely audible over the roaring thunder. "We need to talk to you. We need your help." I crossed my arms over my chest and looked down at him. I did not offer a greeting. I did not ask how they were doing. I simply asked him what he could possibly want from the daughter he had officially fired and permanently discarded. My mother pushed forward, stepping slightly ahead of my father. The heavy rain had completely washed away her pristine, carefully crafted makeup, leaving dark, messy streaks running down her cheeks. She was shivering uncontrollably, her arms wrapped tightly around her own torso. "Oh, Maya, please do not speak to us like that," Vivian cried, her voice pitching high with desperate manufactured emotion. "We are your family. We are your flesh and blood. You have to understand that we were lied to. Julian manipulated all of us. He tricked your father. He tricked your poor sister. We had absolutely no idea he was stealing the employee payroll funds. We did not know he was ruining the company. We were completely blinded by his lies." Behind her, Chloe let out a loud, pathetic sob. My younger sister looked absolutely entirely destroyed. The massive custom-cut platinum diamond ring was noticeably absent from her left hand, likely seized by the federal investigators or pawned to afford the beat-up, aging sedan they had driven here in. Chloe looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Maya, I am so sorry," Chloe whimpered, wiping the rain and tears from her face. "Julian left us with nothing. The banks took the house. They took the cars. Mom and Dad have zero money left. My wedding is canceled. I have absolutely nowhere to go and no way to support myself. We lost everything." My father stepped forward again, reaching a shaking hand toward the glass door, though he did not dare cross the threshold. "Maya, we need you to drop the patent withdrawals," Calvin pleaded, his voice thick with desperate urgency. "We need you to legally reinstate the rights to Soul Roast, Heritage Blend, and Midnight Crown. If you give us the intellectual property back, and if you let us use this warehouse rent-free for just 1 year, I can rebuild the brand. I can secure new loans. I can fix this massive mistake. We can start over together, just the four of us as a real family. I promise you things will be completely different this time. You will be my full partner. I will give you the Chief Executive Officer title you always wanted. Just please, Maya, save us." I looked at the three of them standing in the freezing downpour. I listened to their frantic, manipulative pleas, their desperate attempts to rewrite history and cast themselves as innocent victims of a bad man. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over my mind. They were not sorry for how they had treated me. They were only sorry that they had lost their wealth, their status, and their comfort. I uncrossed my arms and stepped right up to the edge of the threshold. "You want to start over as a family?" I asked, my voice slicing cleanly through the sound of the torrential rain. You want me to hand over the most valuable patents in the industry and let you operate out of my commercial building for free? My father nodded eagerly, a pathetic, desperate spark of hope lighting up his wet face. Yes, he said quickly. Yes, exactly. We can fix Crown Roasters. Crown. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered my response with surgical precision. Crown Roasters is dead, Dad. You killed it. You killed it the exact second you decided your ego was more important than the truth. I pointed a steady finger directly at his chest. You did not get tricked by Julian. You actively chose him. You chose a bankrupt, incompetent stranger over the daughter who spent 12 years breaking her back to keep you afloat. You fired me without cause. You looked me in the face and aggressively threatened to call the police and send me to a federal penitentiary for a crime you knew I did not commit. You were perfectly willing to destroy my entire life just to protect your fragile pride. My father flinched as if I had physically struck him, his eyes dropping to the wet concrete. I turned my gaze to my mother. Vivian shrank back slightly, unable to maintain eye contact. And you? I said, my tone completely devoid of mercy. You grabbed my arm in that office and literally begged me to sign a false confession. You begged me to take the fall for a federal felony just to save your country club reputation and protect Chloe perfect engagement. You demanded I surrender my 20% equity and disappear. You called me difficult. You called me selfish. You told me I lacked grace. You treated my relentless dedication as an embarrassment. You did not act like a mother. You acted like a parasite. My mother let out a loud, shattered wail, burying her face in her wet hands. Finally, I turned to my younger sister was shaking violently, her eyes darting around frantically as she realized the full crushing weight of my words. You called me bossy and aggressive, I reminded her smoothly. You laughed in my face and told me to be grateful I had a job serving the man who was actively stealing the wages of hardworking black men and women just to buy you a shiny piece of jewelry. You enjoyed watching them tear me down because it made you feel superior. I stepped back, taking in the pathetic, ruined portrait of the people who used to be my entire world. I forced them to hear the absolute truth. You did not just lose a business, I declared, my voice echoing off the brick walls of the warehouse. You actively, intentionally threw away the only person who ever actually protected you. I bought this building when you were bankrupt. I secured those patents when your lawyers failed. I saved you 3 years ago and my reward was being treated like an expendable piece of garbage. You threw me to the wolves and now you are upset that I returned leading the pack. The absolute finality of my words crashed down on them. The illusion that they could manipulate their way back into my good graces shattered completely. Vivian let out a desperate, guttural sob. She lunged forward, physically crossing the threshold of the warehouse to escape the freezing rain. She reached out with both hands and grabbed my right hand tightly. Her skin was freezing cold and wet. Maya, please, Vivian sobbed, her voice breaking into a hysterical, high-pitched plea. We have absolutely nowhere else to go. We have no money. We have no home. You cannot do this to us. We are your parents. You are our daughter. You have to help us. I stood perfectly still. I did not pull away immediately. I simply looked down at her shivering, desperate hands gripping mine. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of familial loyalty, any small spark of pity or sadness for the woman who gave birth to me. I found absolutely nothing. I looked down at her hands, feeling nothing but a profound, untouchable, and utterly cold closure. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, breaking the physical contact with my mother. Vivian's hands slipped from my skin, grasping only the empty, freezing air between us. She stumbled forward slightly, her wet shoes slipping on the concrete, but I did not reach out to catch her. I looked at her tear-streaked face and spoke with a voice so calm and absolute it felt like ice water. I told her that she lost the right to call me her daughter the exact moment she sat on that leather sofa and begged me to sign a false confession. I reminded them all that they had actively conspired to send me to a federal penitentiary. They were perfectly willing to let me wear handcuffs and rot behind bars for a decade just to cover up a felony committed by a man they barely knew. My father tried to speak to offer some pathetic justification, but I raised my hand and cut him off completely. I told Calvin that his legacy was not stolen by Julian. His legacy was destroyed by his own uncontrollable ego and his deep-seated refusal to respect the black woman who actually kept his empire alive. I looked at Chloe, who was still sobbing on the pavement, and told her that the real world does not care about her manufactured perfection. I told them I would not give them a single dime. I would not offer them a square inch of my warehouse, and I would absolutely never drop the patent withdrawals to save them. They made their choices, and now they had to survive the consequences without my wallet to protect them. Vivian let out a final desperate wail, begging me not to do this, telling me they had nowhere to go. I looked at the three of them standing in the pouring rain, shivering and ruined. I told them to go find Julian. Then I stepped fully back inside my warm, brightly lit warehouse. I grabbed the heavy glass door and pulled it shut right in their devastated faces. The sound of the heavy deadbolt clicking into place echoed loudly, cutting off the sounds of the thunderstorm and their frantic pleading. I turned my back on them and walked away, finalizing the absolute severance of our relationship. I did not look back. 6 months later, the sun was shining brightly over the city of Atlanta. The heavy dark storms of the past were completely gone, replaced by the brilliant golden light of a crisp autumn afternoon. I stood on the catwalk overlooking the active roasting floor of my warehouse, breathing in the rich, beautiful scent of caramelized coffee beans. The massive industrial roasters hummed with a steady, powerful rhythm. But this time, the machinery did not belong to Crown Roasters. The building, the equipment, and the entire operation belonged exclusively to my own highly successful luxury coffee brand, Ascension Roasters. The name was not just a corporate title, it was a promise. We had risen from the ashes of my catastrophic failure and built something stronger, more ethical, and entirely authentic. Down on the roasting floor, I watched Silas meticulously checking the temperature gauges on the primary drum. He was smiling, laughing at a joke one of the younger apprentices had just made. Across the room, Miss Vonda was leading the packaging line, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she placed our premium ethically sourced beans into sleek matte black bags featuring the Gold Ascension logo. When Crown Roasters filed for bankruptcy and liquidated its assets, I did not just buy the remaining roasting equipment at a fraction of the cost. I personally tracked down every single member of the veteran, predominantly African-American staff that my father and Julian had carelessly discarded. I offered them all permanent positions at Ascension Roasters. But I did not just match their old salaries. I gave them significant raises, comprehensive health benefits, and a genuine stake in the company's success through a generous profit-sharing program. I treated them like the true heartbeat of the business because they were. They were my people, and together we were thriving beyond my wildest expectations. The market response to Ascension Roasters had been absolutely explosive. The luxury boutique hotels, the upscale regional grocery chains, and the high-end independent cafes that had eagerly signed exclusive distribution contracts with me 6 months ago were doubling their orders. Our revenue was breaking records every single quarter. Without the suffocating weight of my father's massive ego or Julian's toxic corporate incompetence holding me back, the brand was expanding rapidly across the South. I was wealthy, I was respected, and for the first time in my entire life, I was completely at peace. As the afternoon shifted into early evening, I walked down the steel staircase and made my way to my spacious corner office. I sat behind my desk reviewing the final quarterly reports, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. My attorney DeAndre had called me earlier that morning to provide a final update on the legal wreckage I had left behind. The justice served was absolute and unyielding. Julian was no longer wearing velvet dinner jackets or pretending to be a tech visionary. He had been found entirely guilty on multiple federal counts of wire fraud and grand embezzlement. The judge did not show him a single ounce of leniency. Julian was currently serving a 15-year sentence in a high-security federal penitentiary, stripped of his arrogance, his freedom, and his stolen wealth. He would spend the next decade and a half locked in a concrete cell paying for the immense damage he had caused. The fate of my biological family was equally severe, a direct and natural consequence of their own profound greed and betrayal. Stripped of their multi-million-dollar estate in Buckhead, their luxury vehicles, and their country club status, my parents had completely fallen from the elite social circles they once desperately clung to. DeAndre informed me that Calvin and Vivian were now living in a cramped, poorly lit two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. The massive bankruptcy had completely destroyed my father's professional reputation, ensuring that no reputable firm in the industry would ever hire him. To make ends meet and avoid total destitution, my parents were forced to take low-level minimum wage retail jobs. The woman who had ruthlessly criticized my practical work clothes and the man who had demanded I surrender my 20% equity were now spending their days wearing polyester uniforms, folding clothes and stocking shelves for ungrateful customers. They were working exhausting, physically demanding shifts just to financially support Chloe, whose life had completely and entirely stalled. Without Julian's stolen money to fund her extravagant lifestyle, and without my relentless labor to subsidize her existence, my younger sister had absolutely nothing. Her entire identity had been built on being the pampered golden child, and without that foundation, she simply crumbled. She refused to find a job, spending her days sitting in their cramped apartment mourning the loss of her custom-cut platinum diamond ring and the luxurious future that had evaporated into thin air. They were trapped in a miserable, suffocating cycle of their own making, drowning in the exact poverty they had always viewed with such intense disgust. I closed the quarterly reports on my encrypted laptop and smiled. I felt no pity for them. They had dug their own graves and now they had to lie in them. I gathered my things, turned off my office lights, and walked out onto the roasting floor. The staff had already finished their shifts and headed home to their families, leaving the warehouse quiet and perfectly still. I walked through the heavy double doors and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sunset was painting the Atlanta sky in vibrant shades of deep purple and brilliant orange. I pulled my keys from my pocket and locked the heavy glass security doors of my booming business, hearing the satisfying solid click of the deadbolt sliding perfectly into place. I turned around and looked up at the front of the warehouse. Mounted high above the entrance, the large, sleek sign for Ascension Roasters was glowing brightly against the darkening sky. The matte black and gold logo stood as a massive, undeniable monument to my resilience, my brilliance, and my sheer, unapologetic strength. I stood there for a long moment, watching the sign illuminate the empty parking lot. I breathed in the crisp autumn air, letting the profound silence wash over me. I was completely unburdened. I had severed the toxic chains of my past, protected the community that mattered, and built an empire that no one could ever take away from me. I smiled, savoring the quiet, beautiful, and entirely untouchable victory of my absolute independence.